building of the pipeline. They
Mm-hmm.
built the or restored the pipeline that Saddam Hussein had cut off. He'd cut the oil off that was going to Israel from Iraq. And
Right.
instead of taking U.S. dollars, he was taking euros. That was his plan, and so
Exactly.
he had to be eliminated.
That was
But
November of 2002. That was probably the key issue that decided the demise of Saddam Hussein. The fact that he made that $1 billion allowed by the UN for food and medicines. He said, "I'm not going to do it in dollars. I'm going to do it in euros this year." March 2003, he was invaded and destroyed.
that's right. And so we're now also. I mean, what we're seeing here is the Rothschild formula. What we're seeing happening is the Rothschild formula. It says, that war is the ultimate discipline to any government. If it can successfully survive or meet the challenge of war, it will survive. If it cannot, it will perish. All that is necessary, therefore, is to ensure that a government will maintain or expand its debt, is to involve it in war, the threat of war. The greater the threat and the more destructive the war, the greater the need for debt. And
Well, you know that. Sorry.
one other paragraph. To involve a country in a war or threat of war will be necessary for it to have enemies of credible military might. If such an enemy exists, all the better. If they exist but lack military strength, it will be necessary to provide them money to build their war machine. If an enemy doesn't exist, then it'll be necessary to create one by financing the rise of a hostile regime. And that's what they did with Russia. That's what or the Soviet Union, and that's what they've done with Red China. I mean, this is a communist country, Red China, folks, and they murdered over 1 million of their people, and they've done the same thing that the Zionists did in Russia. And according to Tex Mars, who's not talking to me at the moment because I disputed, or I questioned the viability of the Pharisee Paul, the Apostle Paul, and so Tex isn't talking to me now, but this is what they've done, and they've set up China now. I mean, China is making all of its money off of Walmart, and they are being raised into a credible enemy. And we find out now that most of our debt is held by Red China.
Yeah, it's their financial A-bomb that they can shoot at America. All they have to do is say, okay, we're going to get rid of our 1.4 trillion U.S. treasuries. We're going to change them into euros, which would probably trigger Japan doing the same with their 1 trillion in U.S. treasuries, and which would probably tempt India and South Korea to do the same. And they have about 1.8 trillion combined. And if you have about $4 or $5 trillion in U.S. treasuries and other U.S. dollar-denominated instruments being changed into euros, and makes those dollar-denominated instruments tend to flow to the United States and its financial circuits, you will be swamped with your own dollars, and that, my friends, is called hyperinflation, and we live through it, and I can guarantee it can bring down a country overnight. Now, what you were just saying is also very interesting, because when you look at the historical dimension of things, you get a better perspective. What you were just describing of America, of what the Rothschilds were saying of a country having to have an enemy, I'm sure you're familiar with that old document from the Hudson Institute called the Iron Mountain Report as to the convenience, the feasibility of having world peace. And it is a report prepared by the Hudson Institute, which is one of these think tanks that works together with the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations and so forth. And back in the 60s, they were apparently asked by then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to say, well, what would happen if world peace were to be declared? And the conclusion is America would not be able to survive world peace because we need an enemy. And if we don't have one, we're going to have to fabricate one. And they even toyed with the idea of fabricating as one of the key enemies a peril from outer space. They just left it there. They didn't go into further detail, but I think we have to keep in mind that very often when we see a lot of these things and a lot of these Hollywood movies talking about aliens and so forth, it could have something to do with something that they have up their sleeve. It might be the ultimate enemy. Ronald Reagan even mentioned that in one of his speeches with Gorbachev. He said, imagine if our two countries had to face an enemy from outer space, we would probably come together and have a common military strategy to combat them. So, all these things have been planned for many, many years. And, in Spanish, I can send it to you, but it's in Spanish. I wrote a book called, the title would be The World's Mastermind, where I centered it on a very detailed analysis of the Council on Foreign Relations, because there's practically no literature in Spanish on the subject, and it's a book that has sold very well down here. And to write it properly, I spent a full week at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. I actually told them, hey, can I go? And they said, sure, come on over. So, it's not that conspirational. They will let in somebody who asks nicely, can I come in? They will let you in. And I went through a lot of documentation, and we were able to see that the CFR, as most people know it, is one of the main engineering and re-engineering planning centers, geostrategic, geoeconomic, as Morris Greenberg says, and geopolitical planning centers. And what they have in common, whether it be the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Conference, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, is that they do long-term planning. And we, as a people in America and Argentina, have grown unfamiliar with long-term planning. One of the things I tell my friends, Clayton, is don't buy newspapers. Because newspapers, what do? They give you little slices of information on very complex issues, whether it be the financial crisis, whether it be new legislation, whether it be the euro, whether it be the crisis in the Middle East or international terrorism or whatever. Little slices of information. They bewilder you. They confuse you because you are saturated with too much information, but you never have the proper perspective to understand what is really happening. So with things nowadays, they are building a world government right in front of our noses, and 99% of the population don't even realize it.
The ultimate obstacle is a government which declines to finance wars through debt. Although this seldom happens, when it does, it will be necessary to encourage internal political opposition to the government or revolution to replace that government that is one that is more compliant to our will. The assassination of heads of state could play an important role in this process. And that tells you exactly what happened to Kennedy, because I have one of Kennedy's $5 bills that says United States note on it, that Johnson recalled as soon as he got into office.
I've got one of those too. It has a red seal instead of a green seal.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That $5 bill is worth about $10,000 now.
Yeah, he issued something like $3.6 billion of 1961 dollars. That was a lot of money at the time. And it does not say Federal Reserve note. It says that it's issued by the United States Treasury. It's real money. It's not funny Fed private money. It's real public money issued by the government of the United States, non-interest bearing. Because you see, people in America, even in America, don't realize every time the Fed gives $1 million to the government for it to distribute and spend and so forth, the government gives the Fed a U.S. Treasury bill that gives them interest. So you are paying trillions of dollars in interest for your own public money, which you shouldn't, because if it's non-interest bearing, public money is just that. If you want interest, go to your local bank and arrange with your local bank if they will give you interest on $1 million or whatever. But the government should never pay interest on the money that it is issuing. It's public money. And so that is how the whole banking system works.
People don't understand. I mean, it was crystal clear to me, Adrian, that when the last thing that George Bush, and I'm kind of a Wallace fan. George Wallace said there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Republicans and Democrats. It's two wings of the same bird. It's the strategy is divide and conquer. And George Bush gave $2 trillion to the owners of the Federal Reserve to bail them out. That $2 trillion could have paid off the mortgage of every American in the country, and yet we got 1 million Americans lost their homes over this. So they've set us up for the same thing that they did to Argentina. It's set up now. It's happening now.
Hey, as I said a little earlier in the program, I'm 58, and I do remember George Wallace because I was brought up in the States. I was brought up in New York City from 1957 till about 1969, and I do remember the governor of Alabama, George Wallace. So I can share. He was even a candidate for president. President until he was shot. I think he was left paralytic or something.
That's right. They shot him.
Exactly. Now, and I'd like to add something to this because, as I think that what I can bring to the table for you and for Americans as a whole is a perspective from another part of the world where we see things very differently. Where we've had another